Hi everyone, welcome to this edition of History with Sai. In the last episode on the history of ancient Canaan, we left off where that land was going through a period of economic turmoil. This was largely due to the collapse of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, Canaan's main trading partner. Many Canaanite towns and cities depopulated as large percentages of their residents searched for greener pastures elsewhere. However, by 2000 BCE, Egypt's political and economic stability had been greatly restored due to the wise rule of Mentuhotep II, the fourth pharaoh of Egypt's 11th dynasty. He reunified the country and started the period of Egyptian history that scholars call the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep's administration provided both stability and support for commerce between Egypt and its neighbors, especially the cities of Canaan. Of course, change didn't happen overnight, but within a few decades, Canaanite cities began to reverse the trend of depopulation and by and large become prosperous once again. In fact, several of these cities were important enough to have shown up in Egyptian texts. These included Ashkelon, Byblos, and Jerusalem. Though Canaan was back on the path to prosperity, that doesn't mean that every Canaanite was returning to or remaining there. In fact, evidence shows that many Canaanites migrated to Egypt, especially to the Nile Delta region. There's a very famous mural on the wall of the tomb of an Egyptian nobleman at the site of Beni Hassan. Dated to around 1900 BCE, it depicts what are clearly a people of Canaanite origin being introduced to an Egyptian court. One can tell that they're Canaanites due to the style of dress and the weapons that they're carrying. As further proof of their presence in Egypt, several discoveries in the Delta region have uncovered what can only have been Canaanite settlements due to the architectural style of the buildings as well as the pottery shards and other artifacts that have been found within them. Some religious scholars use such evidence to support their claim that certain characters from well-known Bible stories, such as Joseph, his brothers, and their father Jacob, arrived and settled in Egypt around this time. In fact, Joseph's high position in the pharaoh's government has led some people to believe that perhaps Egypt was not only very friendly towards Canaanites, but that it may have also been ruled at the time by the Canaanite people known in history as the Hyksos, who we'll talk about in a few moments. There's obviously no way to scientifically prove this, but if you believe the biblical story, then the possibility exists that the early Hebrews entered Egypt the same way that many other Canaanites did. In fact, technically, they would have been Canaanites themselves. Remember, we stated in the last episode that Canaanites were not a homogeneous bunch, but rather diverse groups of peoples and tribes who occupied the geographic region we identify today as Canaan. Anyway, by 1700 BCE, there were many people of Canaanite origin living in Egypt. In many books and translations of Egyptian and Greek texts, these people are called Asiatics. But since this is a program about Canaan, and we know that they were mostly of Canaanite origin, I'm going to use the word Canaanite when referring to them in general. However, when I refer to the dynasty of Canaanites who eventually went on to rule Egypt, I'll use the term Hyksos, which in Greek means rulers of foreign lands. Ancient Egyptian and later Greek texts don't contain very flattering accounts of the Hyksos. According to them, the Hyksos came across the Sinai desert and into Egypt like a shock of lightning, burning its cities and massacring their populations while selling any surviving women and children into slavery. They then established their own dynasty and ended up ruling all of Egypt. We know now, though, that this isn't exactly true, and such stories may have been concocted later on by their enemies, who hated not just the presence of foreigners in their land, but being ruled by them as well. Most Canaanites came into Egypt without much trouble, and they came for different reasons. Many came with trading companies and caravans. Others came as laborers, as there were good farming and construction jobs in Egypt. A number were also mercenaries who manned fortresses and patrolled the borders of the Egyptian kingdom. These, though, were the ones that came willingly. A large percentage of the Canaanite population in Egypt had also been brought there as slaves. Regardless, though, of how they got there, Many of them eventually ended up staying in Egypt, having families and building their own communities. As far as we can tell, most of them integrated into Egyptian society quite well. However, around 1640 BCE, the Middle Kingdom collapsed. Without a strong central government, Egypt broke up into various small kingdoms ruled by local princes. This short period from 1640 to about 1550 BCE is what's become known in Egyptian history as the Second Intermediate Period. During this time, a group, or perhaps groups of Canaanites, gained control of eastern parts of the Nile Delta. Moving south and making treaties with other Egyptian princes, or subduing them with the aid of Egyptian allies, the Canaanite, Hyksos as we'll call them, established themselves firmly in most of the Nile Delta, as well as the regions to the south. As their capital, they chose the city of Avaris in the eastern delta. However, the rulers of the city of Thebes, who were said to have been anti-Hyksos, halted their expansion into Upper Egypt. There's a lot about the Hyksos that we could discuss, but I'm going to save that for a future episode. What I do want to delve into is their impact on Canaan itself. While it's hard to determine just how much, if any, political control the Hyksos residing in Avaris had over the cities and towns in Canaan, there's almost no doubt that they were on very friendly terms with the area. And why wouldn't they be? Most scholars believe that Canaan was their ancestral homeland. This resulted in probably the best commercial relationship that the two lands had ever shared in their respective histories, and also helped to flower what archaeologist and Canaanite scholar Jonathan Tubbs states was the golden age of Canaanite culture. He writes in one of his books, "Unhindered by the power struggles and foreign interventions that were able to dominate the region's history in the second half of the millennium, Canaanite culture flourished unrestrained. Architecture, art, and craftsmanship achieved levels of accomplishment and sophistication which were to provide the ancient Near East with an enduring legacy well into the following millennium." The artwork from the period is reflective of this. For example, the hoard of gold jewelry found at the site of Tel El Ajul near the coast of the Mediterranean Sea illustrates the skill and expertise of Canaanite artisans. Many of these contain motifs borrowed from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, and even the Aegean, which are expressed in a totally Canaanite way. Along with these areas, trade with places such as Cyprus and Anatolia also increased during this time. Given its many Mediterranean ports at the crossroads of Asia and Africa, this is hardly a surprise. However, we should also recognize the ingenuity of the Canaanites themselves as one of the major factors for their success. It was during the Middle Bronze Age that the first serious attempt at devising a workable alphabetic system was created to replace the time-consuming and somewhat cumbersome cuneiform and hieroglyphic styles of writing that were common during those days. Most textbooks credit the Phoenicians for this achievement, but in reality, Phoenician is simply the Greek name for the Canaanites of the Iron Age who lived along the eastern Mediterranean coast in cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. While the Phoenicians may have modified this alphabet to have made it easier to use, and then later on, this alphabet was adopted and modified even further by Greeks and Etruscans for their use, the real origins of this alphabetic system are now believed by most to have been formed during the Middle Bronze Age in Canaan. There were also innovations in construction, most notably with regard to temples and fortresses. One type of temple style that became common during the Middle Bronze Age was a rectangularly shaped structure with an entrance in one of its short walls. Known as a migdal, or fortress temple, its walls were extremely thick and tall, perhaps at least 2 stories in height. It generally had 2 tower-like structures towards the front, often with stairwells within them. The temple's roof was supported by large columns. Such places of worship have been uncovered at several sites throughout Canaan and the Levant, including Megiddo, Hatzor, Alak, and even Ebla in northeastern Syria. In the 16th century BCE, opposition to Hyksos rule in Egypt gained momentum. Led by Kamose of the native 17th dynasty based in the city of Thebes, Egyptian forces fought hard against the Hyksos for several decades. Around 1550 BCE, Kamoz's brother, Ahmose, who founded the 18th dynasty, defeated them and forced them to flee to Canaan. However, the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were not satisfied. Egypt had learned a great lesson from its experience with the Hyksos. It was vulnerable, especially from the east. To prevent future invasions, Egyptian foreign policy had to change. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty vowed that Egypt would never again be invaded and controlled by foreigners. Instead, they would launch a sustained program of expansion towards the east in order to control Canaan and any other lands that might pose a threat to Egypt. What would follow would be several centuries of Egyptian domination of Canaan in a sort of great game that was played with the other powers of the region, namely the Kingdom of the Mitanni and the Hittite Empire. We'll cover this period in the next episode on the history of Canaan. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. If you learned something or simply just enjoyed the video, please hit that like button because it helps the channel out a lot. Also, check out the History with Sai podcast where I go into more detail with regard to some of the topics discussed on the channel. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Take care and stay safe.